Hey guys, today we're in week number 4 of our series on the book of First Peter. We're calling the series Culture Wars. And so far we've been talking a lot about sort of the war that we as Christians often have with our secular society, with our secular culture. But when we get to chapter 4, and therefore lesson number 4, we realize that there's a war on the inside that we have to win. That's our big idea for today's lesson. The culture war isn't just a battle that we fight on the outside. There's a character war that we first need to win on the inside. So let's open our Bibles to 1 Peter chapter 4, and we're going to take a look at these 5 things that Peter outlines for us as far as winning the war within. And the first thing we're going to realize is that we have to chase God. Those are his words. Verse 2, Peter says, "You won't spend the rest of your lives chasing your own desires, but you will be anxious to do the will of God." Now, I want you to pay attention to some of the words that he uses here. He talks about chasing your own desires as opposed to chasing the will of God. And I wonder if you've ever thought about your Christian faith in those terms before. Do you chase God like you chase your desires? Not even necessarily just your sinful desires. There are a lot of things in our lives, certainly as Americans, that we get really excited about, that we chase after, that we're eager to do. But so many Christians don't think about their faith like that. It's not an active pursuit. It's something that maybe they do every once in a while on a Sunday morning, and then they sort of put God on the back burner for the rest of the week. Peter says that we should be anxious to do the will of God, that we should chase God with purpose and fervor. Now that relates to the second thing on our list as far as winning the war within. Peter reminds us not to plunge into destruction. He says in verses 3 and 4, "You've had enough in the past of the evil things that godless people enjoy, their immorality and their lust, their feasting and drunkenness and wild parties, their terrible worship of idols. Your former friends are surprised when you no longer plunge into the flood of wild and destructive things that they do." This list kind of reminds me of a college fraternity, and a lot of people, Christians included, never grow out of this. And so again, pay attention to the word that Peter uses. He says that you plunge into this flood of destruction. This is probably the clearest example of winning the war within, but I want you to be honest with your family, with your small group, or with your mentor. Are some of these things on this list that you see part of your life? Maybe not during the weekday, but are they part of your life on the weekend? You know, I pastor a church, and there are a lot of people in our church who shockingly still live like the rest of the world, which means that they're not winning at the culture war because, obviously, they're not winning the war within. Now, the next thing on Peter's list is a little more spiritual. He tells us to sharpen our prayers. Verse 7, "The end of the world is coming soon. Therefore, be earnest and disciplined in your prayers." About 15 years ago, I had to sharpen my prayer life when the doctors told me that I had cancer. Now, it turns out that it wasn't true. I didn't have cancer, but they said that I did, and that it was eating away at my body. And so my wife and I, with 2 young kids at the time, sharpened our prayers. The trial pushed us toward God. The trial made our prayer life better instead of making it bitter. And so in your life, as this culture becomes increasingly more secular, it's so important for you, if you're going to retain your faith, if you're going to win the war within, it's so important for you to sharpen your prayers. We've got more resources about prayer and how to pray, some good helpful tips in our library at PursueGOD.org. I encourage you to check them out. Now, step 4, Peter says to show love in practical ways. In verse 8, he says, "Most important of all, continue to show deep love for each other, for love covers a multitude of sins." And then he says, "Cheerfully share your home with those who need a meal or a place to stay." And what I love about verse 9 is just how practical Peter gets there. You know, it's easy as Christians to talk about love. God is love, we love each other, but words are cheap. And so many of us use the word love. We talk about loving the community of faith, which Peter has already been talking about earlier in his book, and yet we don't act on it in a practical way. And so Peter gives just one example right here of how to actually act on your love. He says, share your home with those who need a meal or a place to stay. Now, honestly ask yourself, when's the last time you did that? In fact, a great exercise with your small group would be to write out some other practical ways that you can actually love people in your church or in your community. And then Peter ends this section with a challenge to use your spiritual gifts. Verse 10, he says, God has given each of you a gift from his great variety of spiritual gifts. Use them well to serve one another. Do you have the gift of speaking? Then speak as though God himself were speaking through you. Do you have the gift of helping others? Then do it with all the strength and energy that God supplies. Now, I don't know if you've ever noticed this before, but it seems to me that Peter is breaking down the spiritual gifts into two main categories: the speaking gifts and the helping gifts. You can go back and take a look at how Paul talks about the spiritual gifts in some of his letters. Paul gives a lot more detail, but Peter just sort of keeps it simple. And I think the key is this: if you want to win the war within, then you should serve someone else. You should use the spiritual gifts that God has given you, both inside the church and outside the church, to serve someone else. That's actually the key to winning that character battle on the inside. Because remember, it's not about you. So if you want to win the war within, your last step is to look outward. There you have it, the 5 keys that Peter gives us in chapter 4 for those who want to win the war within, that character war, which is so crucial for those who want to win the culture wars in today's world. Now, find more resources to talk about this topic with your family or your small group or your mentor at PursueGOD.org/1Peter.